Welcome to our first video in the learning unit. I want to first apologize for my voice. I've been trying to wait as long as possible to get this video done, but as the unit's been assigned, we need to go ahead and get this video done and get it posted. So next year, this will have to be one that I redo instead of having my I have a cold voice going on here. Okay, so we're in the unit called learning, and we're discussing learning. We're not talking about what we typically think of with learning in terms of what we do in a school, studying calculus or AP US history or anything along those lines. For our purposes, for psychology class, learning is going to be a relatively permanent behavioral change that is due to experience. Okay, so we're talking about how we pick up the habits and the responses that we have to the environment in which we live. So this is much less about the kind of forced, effortful learning that we have in the school, and more about the more or less effortless learning that goes on in our day-to-day environment. Why do we run to the chocolate cake when we are feeling sad or stressed? Why does a certain smell make us feel a certain way? Those types of things that we're not really trying to have happen, but have just happened along the way during our lifetime. So we're talking about that type of learning. And so we can illustrate this by thinking about three different examples. Think about what happens when you, or how you respond when you see lightning, how you respond when you hear a bell that signals the end of class, and how you respond to when you smell your favorite dish being cooked at home or at a restaurant. When you think about your responses, I would probably for most of these, especially the second two, you're going to have a fairly similar response. For many humans, when we see lightning, there is a tension or at least an anticipation of thunder coming, because throughout our entire life, lightning has been associated with a thunder or a loud noise coming. As a young child, the thunder may have even been scary to us. And loud noises typically just are inherently scary for younger children. And it's part of the reason why people develop a fear of lightning at an early age. It's not really about what the electricity can do to you at a young age. It's more about the fact that we associate it with this loud noise. For most high school students who go to school in a setting in which the bell signals the end of class, for most students, a bell means that I am packing up my things and getting up. And so that's your typical response. If they happen to do a little experiment in your school and were to move the bells 4 minutes early and start ringing them, then most people would pack up their things and go without much of a thought about that. The fact this class is ending any earlier than normal. The bell means get up. That's what we do. And so we've learned to associate that bell ringing with it's time to go. And of course, for most of us, when we smell our favorite dish, you may not realize it, you may not consciously think of it, but you're salivating. You're getting ready your mouth is getting ready for the digestive process. It wants to eat. And because you've learned to associate that smell with that dish. Now, none of these associations you were born with, none of them. These are all things that you've learned over time. And as you learn them, they become such a part of you, such a habit for you, that it almost feels as if you were born with these associations. But of course, they've been, again, developed over time. So what we're talking about here is exactly what we just mentioned, something called associative learning. You're learning that certain events occur together. Cookies or smell with the cookies, lightning with thunder, bell with getting up and getting ready to go. And so conditioning is simply the process of learning these associations. And throughout this unit, we're going to learn about two fundamental types of conditioning, classical and operant, and we'll get into those two a little bit in a couple other videos. Classical today and operant next video. So when the school bell rings, again, we've talked about it. The school bell rings, it's not just that you pack up your things and get ready to go. Most of you have an emotional response to the bell ringing as well. There's a sense of relief. There's a sense of happiness. For most students, there's an excitement, especially at the end of the day. Hey, the day is over. I get to go do what I want to do now. And so it's not just a signal that a behavior is coming. It's a signal that an emotional change is happening as well. Let's imagine that we were in school one day and the bell malfunctioned and sounded 10 to 15 times in class. Um, how would your response be different? Well, for most of us, we may kind of look at the clock initially and figure out what's going on. But over time, most of us, our reaction would diminish. We would start to learn in that short period of time that the bell during that class, because it's malfunctioning, doesn't actually mean anything. And in this case, we have a habituation to the bell. We have a decreasing response to that repeated stimulus, that our response just isn't as strong. And in fact, it will go away over time as we develop more and more sense that the bell in that situation doesn't actually mean anything. All right, so we're going to jump into our first type of associative learning, and that is classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is when an animal or human is learning to link two environmental stimuli and to anticipate events. So it's not really associating their behavior with anything. That's going to be a different type of conditioning that we'll talk about in a little bit or in the next video. But this is associating two things in the environment, and by associating those two things, we start to be able to anticipate that, hey, this means that this other thing is happening. And so we're typically linking some sort of natural response with some sort of non-natural stimuli. And there's some terminology we need to get down with classical conditioning. So what we're going to do here is I'll just kind of run through what each of these terms mean, and then we'll go through them again in context of an example, and hopefully it'll be clear to you at the end of it. In classical conditioning, an unconditioned stimulus is something in the environment that you have a natural or innate response to. Okay, and so, for example, if we were to put a type of food, if we put food in your mouth that you actually enjoy, a cookie, so let's say you like chocolate chip cookies, your mouth's natural response is to salivate. The unconditioned stimulus there is the food, and the unconditioned response, the natural response, is the fact that you salivate. So in this case, unconditioned is, you can consider it to be synonymous with the concept of unlearned. You didn't have to learn it; it just happens. In classical conditioning, what we're doing now is we're pairing what is initially a neutral stimulus with this unconditioned stimulus. So let's go back to the cookie example. Initially, the very first time you smelled chocolate chip cookies, it was a neutral stimulus. The stimulus didn't actually mean anything to you. And if you're a fan of chocolate chip cookies like I am, that may be very difficult to even fathom, that there was a time in which chocolate chip cookies didn't signal salivation, a hunger, and a desire to get your hands on that yummy goodness. But in fact, there was early on that didn't mean anything to you. It just meant there was something novel in the environment. And so over time, as you've been around people making chocolate chip cookies, that neutral stimulus initially, the smell, has always been paired with that unconditioned stimulus, the cookie, and that is, again, having that unconditioned response, the salivation. Now, in this case, it's still the cookie that's causing the salivation, so still an unconditioned response. You pair them enough times, though, and then now you can simply walk by a bakery that's making chocolate chip cookies, and that neutral that neutral stimulus, the smell, has now become a conditioned stimulus. We have learned to associate that stimulus with something else, in this case, the cookies, and it produces a conditioned response. The conditioned response is almost always identical to or very similar to the unconditioned response. So in this scenario, the neutral stimulus of the smell of the cookie, it's been paired enough times with the actual cookie itself, it becomes the conditioned stimulus, and now it produces salivation. We salivate even though we may not even be getting our hands on a cookie that time, even though we may know consciously that we're not actually going to be stopping at all at the bakery. The smell alone will make us have a response that is uncontrollable. You're not going to be able to control the salivation. It's just going to happen. And so that's what we're talking about with classical conditioning. Now, all this was developed, or at least the initial ideas behind it, developed by Pavlov in his experiment with dogs. He noticed that dogs didn't just salivate at the sight of food, they also started to salivate at the sight of the person who fed them. And he thought that was odd. He thought that it was odd that they would salivate at the sight of a person. Or he thought that. And so he decided to run some experiments to test exactly what's going on here. And so for him, in his work with his dogs, his unconditioned stimulus was the food in the mouth. And he measured the level of salivation that occurred with that. That's, of course, the unconditioned response. His measurement of that is a bit barbaric in that he's cutting slits in their cheeks right by the gland that is producing the saliva. And in doing so, he's able to get a much more accurate measurement of how much the dog is actually salivating. And so he started to pair a neutral stimulus, this tone, with the food. So initially he presents the tone. Of course, the tone initially means nothing to the dogs. There is no salivation. Neutral stimulus produces nothing other than maybe a quizzical look by the dog just to see what it is. So he starts to pair tone with food, tone with food. Every time he brings the tone, the food is presented a couple of seconds later. And the dog, of course, salivates. He's still salivating because of the food in this case. But then finally, after conditioning, you present the tone, and the dog salivates. Now, one of the things that's true typically with conditioned responses is that the conditioned response may not quite be as strong as the unconditioned response, but nevertheless, it is very similar and sometimes identical. Okay, so Pavlov is really the first guy to really establish this principle in research. And again, he did it with his research on dogs, and that they would salivate at the sound of a tone when the tone is paired with the presentation of food. Now, a couple of other terms to get down with classical conditioning. First is acquisition. Acquisition is that process of associating a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus. You are acquiring a conditioned response to that neutral stimulus. And so there's a couple of scenarios I want you to think about with acquisition. Number one, or between these two scenarios, which do you think would be more likely to produce acquisition? If the bell was rung with the dog after the food was presented, so in other words, instead of saying tone then food, what if Pavlov had said food then tone? Would that in fact produce a conditioned response of salivation at the tone? Or what if he rang the bell 5 minutes ahead of time? Would that produce a conditioned response for the dog as well? So in other words, ring the bell, 5 minutes later, feed the dog. When looking at those two scenarios, the answer, in fact, is that neither would produce a conditioned response. Because in the first scenario, if the bell is rung after the food is presented, the bell, in fact, means nothing to the dog. They've already gotten their food. The bell is not signaling anything. The bell, therefore, would not cause the dog to anticipate anything. The dog has already received his food. As far as the 5 minutes is concerned, most species can't learn to associate something with that great of a gap between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. Humans, it is somewhat, we are capable of doing that with a higher level of thinking, but for most species, it's not going to be the case. And so actually conditioning or acquisition wouldn't happen there either. So typically what we're talking about, if we're learning to associate, if we're teaching the dog to associate this tone with the food, we're talking about at maximum 15 to 30 seconds gap between the tone and the food to still produce salivation. And honestly, the shorter the gap, the better. The shorter the gap, the more likely they're going to learn that association. So another term is higher order conditioning. Let's imagine we have this dog that we've already taught to salivate at the sound of a bell. And so now the question is, if the dog has learned to salivate at the sound of a bell, can we pair something else with the sound of the bell? And will that, in fact, then produce another conditioned response? So can we take the same dog, show it an object, say a picture of a circle, and show it the picture of the circle, then ring the bell. Show it the picture of the circle, then ring the bell. Show it the picture of the circle, then ring the bell. Never associating the picture with food, would they in fact still salivate? Because remember, the bell in this case produces salivation because they've already been conditioned to associate the bell with food. And the answer is yes. The dog would in fact learn to associate this picture, the shape, with the bell that produces salivation, and the shape would in fact produce salivation as well. That's what we call higher order conditioning. You learn a new conditioned response to a previously conditioned stimulus. And one of the things you need to know about higher order conditioning is that typically the response to that second conditioned, that second stimulus is usually a little bit weaker than the first conditioned stimulus. Okay, but that's higher order conditioning. Now, let's imagine that we have conditioned the dog to salivate at the sound of the bell, but we don't want him to do that anymore. Can you uncondition it? And the answer, of course, is yes. And what you just need to do is continually present the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus. So if you continually presented the bell with no food, Over time, the dog will learn that the bell, in fact, signals nothing anymore. And so the salivation would slowly decrease and decrease until the point that we get no salivation at all. And that process is called extinction. And so we can see on this chart what might happen here. With the horizontal axis indicating time and the vertical axis indicating the strength of the response, in this case, how much they salivate. So we have the initial acquisition, and so the salivation becomes stronger and stronger at the sound of the tone. And then we start to present the conditioned stimulus alone, just the tone, with no food. And so extinction slowly starts to occur. Now, one of the interesting things that happens is that if you then pause and then present the bell a few days later, never having it associated it with food again, we're going to have something that's called spontaneous recovery. The definition for spontaneous recovery is the unpredictable return of an extinct conditioned response after a rest period, indicating that that connection is still there in the brain in some way, and then it would go through a process of declining again until we extinguish again. So spontaneous recovery does happen sometimes as well. Now, if a dog is conditioned to salivate the sound of a bell, we'll also salivate the sound of a different bell. And the answer is, generally speaking, yes. Generally speaking, the dog will take anything that is remotely similar and learn to associate that same thing with the in this case, food. And so we have a tendency, this is all species, including humans, the tendency for stimuli similar to the conditioned stimuli to elicit a similar response. If you remember at the beginning of the year, we read about little Albert, who was conditioned to fear white rabbits. And with that conditioned fear of white rabbits, he also learned to fear basically anything that was white and furry, and also any type of rabbit, no matter what color it was. That's a generalization of that fear response. It's not, typically it's not a specific thing. If you think about that's an adaptive trait. It's best to be overly vigilant and overly fearful rather than under fearful in the case of little Albert when we're living in kind of a natural habitat. That being said, while generalization is the norm, you can teach a dog to respond to just one bell and not the other. But it takes a specific type of training. And what you'd have to do is to always pair bell, tone A with the food and never associate or never pair tone B with food. And over time, as long as the dog has the sensory ability to tell the difference between the tones, then yes, over time the dog would learn, okay, this tone actually means food, this tone does not mean food, and it would only salivate at the sound of the tone that in fact means food. So that's a process called discrimination. Of course, just to be clear, in this case, we are in no way talking about discrimination as in we're judging a group of people based on stereotypes and prejudice. In this case, we're simply talking about the ability to discriminate or tell the difference between stimuli. All right, and that ends our video for today. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at ghsteacher@gmail.com, or else you can talk to me in class. Have a good night.